What's up, guys? This is TheKephas. So I would like to take some time and talk about the story of World of Warcraft and its direction. And the reason why I want to do this is because it seems like it's become a more heated subject in the WoW community. And I honestly don't know why stuff like this gets so heated. At the end of the day, it's just a story about a video game that's rated T for teen. I mean, I understand that many of us are passionate about this, but I would like to remind everyone that at the end of the day, it's just a story and it's just opinions and it's all harmless. But with all that being said, I would like to give my thoughts on it. And I'd be very curious to hear what other people think about this as well. If you're into the story, how do you feel about it? And what would you like to see from it? So I feel like this issue has become more of a problem ever since Metzen left Blizzard initially, when he first retired and he handed the reins off to someone else. And that kind of started at the beginning of BFA. That's when a lot of the problems that a lot of people had started to rise up, okay? And it sort of took a nosedive from there in Shadowlands. And it hit rock bottom. In a lot of ways, I feel it damaged the story. A lot of the best parts of the story, I feel like Shadowlands really messed up, to the point where I would be okay if they retconned the whole expansion out of the story. I think it would fix things in a lot of ways. It would at least restore some things to what they once were. In the case of Dragonflight, I would say personally that it's not necessarily a bad story, but it's also not a very compelling one, in my opinion. Maybe other people enjoy it, but for me, it's not very gripping.
The Dragon Queen dies alone.
I am not alone. Do you not see? All of Azeroth stands united against you.
What the hell is that?
I think that the problem with Dragonflight is a problem you see in a lot of other entertainment media as well. You know, you look at what's happening with The Witcher on Netflix, the horrible box office on the Marvels. You see a lot of these other stories that sort of lose a bit of their identity. I think that's what I would classify the problem as, is there's a loss of identity, of what makes it work in the first place. And when you have people that take over a story and they start to write a different story, or they start to take it in a direction that isn't as compelling as it once was, that's when you have a lot of issues. You get new people involved who have different ideas, have different definitions of what compelling is, or maybe even have other motives for why they're writing their story that don't mix with the audience of that story. So with all that being said, let's talk about WoW, and let's start off with, what is WoW's identity? And this is sort of difficult to, I guess, explain, because it would be very easy to say, well, WoW's identity is a bunch of sweaty, muscular dudes fighting in rivers of blood and hot mage babes. That's WoW's identity. I do think that is part of WoW's identity, but I also think that just chalking it up to that alone is a massive disservice to what WoW's identity is. I don't necessarily think that you just need to have a bunch of sweaty dudes fighting and hot chicks. I'm okay with those things being part of the story, and I think those things should be part of the story. But I also think there's a deeper aspect to it, a more important aspect to it that WoW is kind of missing. So what is WoW's identity? The name of the game is Warcraft. World of Warcraft, but initially Warcraft. It started off being a story, from my knowledge, of a war between orcs and humans. Humans from Azeroth being invaded by orcs from Draenor. And back in the early days, it was very clear who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. Eventually, that story evolved. Actually, the trolls, the orcs, and even the undead have a point. They have a validation. They have a reason to fight that you can sort of understand. And so you can understand how the people on the Alliance feel and understand their issues, but you can also understand how the people in the Horde feel. They need a place to live. They need a place to call home. They need their freedom and their place in the world. And so that's what they're fighting for. So now you have two opposing sides, neither of which are the hero nor the villain. Both are compelling and both have a valid reason for fighting. And so there is no right and wrong answer there. And that was a very compelling story. Warcraft is a story about conflict. Sometimes that conflict is very cut and dry. You know who the good guys are, you know who the bad guys are, and that's it. Other times, the conflict is a little less certain. There really aren't good guys and bad guys here. You kind of feel for both in a lot of ways. And sometimes it starts off that way and then it becomes more cut and dry, like in the case of the Lich King. You start off feeling bad for Arthas and understanding where the position he's in, but over time you see him slip and fall into what he becomes. So that's a good, compelling story that expands and evolves the conflict that's happening. There is conflict within the character, there is conflict with the character and other characters, and that evolves and becomes an even bigger problem, to the point where everybody has to work together to deal with that conflict. When you know what the conflict is, you know the motivations of both sides, and you are working to resolve that conflict in some way. The conflict itself isn't what's compelling, it's the nature of the opposing sides within that conflict. So for example, when Garrosh first bombed Theramore, it didn't really translate very well. A lot of people were confused, wondering what happened, because for a lot of people, the last time we had saw Garrosh, he was actually punishing somebody else for launching the exact same bomb on a different civilization. So when you see him stopping or at least punishing that and saying this is not what the Horde is about, to then doing that, what is going on? For me, reading that book about what happened to Theramore, the whole time I was just wondering, why is this happening? I don't understand this. This doesn't make any sense. Garrosh would never do this. Why is he doing this? Well, it's because they retconned what happened in Stone Talon Mountains, and they made Garrosh a xenophobic psychopath. And that's why, while in the end it was a pretty compelling character and a good villain, a lot of people to this day don't care for that story because it didn't make sense, and because for the longest time no one knew what his motivations were and why he was doing it. Similar situation with Illidan. Why are we fighting him in Burning Crusade? There's a reason why that didn't work, and it's because we didn't fully understand his motivations. They had to go back and fix it in Legion, and once we understood his motivations, it made him a much more compelling character, because at least we understood what he was doing. But then you have other situations, right? Like with Sylvanas. The problem with BFA's conflict, which was sort of a rehash of the Alliance versus the Horde, is that we didn't know why the Horde was behaving the way it was. Specifically, why Sylvanas was behaving the way she was. Why is she destroying Teldrassil? Why did this happen? No one knew. And that's why it wasn't compelling for a lot of people. It was frustrating because we didn't know why the conflict was happening. And when you are a character that is involved in this conflict, as a character, as a member of the Horde, with this story, you have to make it very clear to the player why they're doing the things that they're doing, why they're involved in this conflict. You have to set that up initially and then evolve it over time. When you fail to set that anchor and fail to identify what the opposing members of the conflict are and why they're at conflict with one another, when you fail to nail that down, it makes no sense and no one cares. So you have to invest people in that conflict. Along with that, you have to have stakes. Sometimes the stakes can be lower. They don't always have to be high, but what is most important is that you understand what the stakes are. So with Shadowlands, one of the biggest problems is that it was hard to understand what the stakes were. You have a villain that is going to try and, I guess, rewrite reality. What does that even mean? He's going to reshape all of reality. That is such a grand concept that it just kind of loses its translation in a lot of ways. A contrast to that, I think, is Cataclysm, where the stakes were incredibly high. We were talking about in Cataclysm destroying Azeroth, the planet, the world that everybody lived on. One of the best concepts, I think, in World of Warcraft's history, where you have this dragon who literally reshapes the world just by moving. And you realize this thing can destroy the planet. It can destroy everyone's home. This place where we have been running around for the past several years could be destroyed by this dragon. And that's exactly how it felt. And they did a good job with that. So even though the stakes are still really high, really astronomical, they're a lot easier to understand and they're a lot easier to sort of see what's happening in the world, because the world did change. It did get wrecked a little bit, and you know now what's going to happen if the player doesn't stop this dragon. So that's how you can show stakes. You can do a lesser degree as well. A good example of that would have been in Mists of Pandaria, where you go to Pandaria and you see all the conflict that's happening there. You have the oppressive swarm of the Mantid just waiting to cross over and just swarm all of Pandaria. You have the Mogu just waiting for their opportunity to gain a foothold. You know, you have the Shah looming and the citizens of Pandaria having to keep their emotions in check. Even the trolls showing up and causing some trouble. You have a lot of different forms of conflict, and it's a little bit of a, smaller stakes, but it's there. And then it obviously culminates in the conflict between Garrosh's horde and the other citizens of Azeroth. And that's also somewhat of a smaller scale, certainly a smaller scale than, say, like Cataclysm or even Arthas, who's going to, destroy all life, but it's still a problem, and you understand what the conflict is. That's why that worked as well. So if you look at, say, Dragonflight now, and you have this villain, I apologize, I don't know his name. He's a dragon and he's fiery and he's like a discount Ragnaros. The villains in WoW don't seem to have a lot of teeth. They don't seem to be very threatening. They don't tend to succeed at things a lot of times. They just kind of get repeatedly thwarted. There's no perceived threat because they've never succeeded at anything. So that's kind of where a problem kind of comes in as well. Sometimes things have to be a little bit heavier. They have to hit a little bit harder.
It was about coming together as a family.
And so we did.
Perhaps as we were always meant to.
Oh my God. What a bunch of pussies.
You go back in the story in the past and you even up to the Lich King, and you see how gritty things get, and sometimes you have torture, sometimes you have genocide, sometimes you have lots of people getting wiped out, you have important characters dying, these sorts of things that are adding a degree of real emotion to the story.
Did you think we had forgotten? Did you think we had forgiven? Behold now the terrible vengeance of the Forsaken! Sylvanas. Death to the Scourge! and death to the living!
So my wife and I, we have similar tastes in what we like, but there's a bit of a spectrum. She tends to enjoy stories that have more drama, and I tend to enjoy stories that have more action. And there's a middle ground. So let's say, like for me, one of my favorite movies is the movie 300.
And these shields, boys!
I know it's not historically accurate. I know it's ridiculous. I love that about it. I love the over-the-top action. I love the injection of testosterone that movie provides. It gets my blood pumping. It's a great movie. So then there's my wife, and one of her favorite shows, her favorite show of all time, in fact, is Gilmore Girls.
Stop talking to me, stop following me, and stop asking me questions. Just stop.
That's what you want?
Yes.
That's really what you want?
Yes.
Fine, you got it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have heard that show from beginning to end probably 7 or 8 times now. To the point where I know the characters, I know what happens, I know the story. I actually don't mind the show very much. It's not that bad of a show. It's definitely tolerable. It's not the worst show ever. It's not my cup of tea, but I don't mind it so much. So if you have a spectrum and say one end is 300, high octane action, and on the other end is Gilmore Girls, very low action and more drama, then somewhere in that spectrum is where World of Warcraft would be, where there's a degree of drama and there's a degree of action. WoW has always been a story of drama. It has always had drama. It has always had characters conveying how they feel. So the idea of dealing with feelings isn't an issue. A lot of it is how that is expressed and how it's demonstrated in the story.
Your faith has blinded you. There can be no chosen one. Only we can save ourselves.
I think that the problem with WoW these days is it's shifted a little bit too much towards Gilmore Girls. Just a little bit too much. Where instead of conveying the feelings of the characters, seeing their evolution, it's more telling. It's more discussing. Like feeling like it's a therapy session in a lot of ways. It's like the writer comes up with a cool quote that they think is going to like really hit the nail on the head, and it comes off very cringy. You're looking for the feelings to be expressed with fewer words and more actions, because it's more compelling that way and because that's how WoW has always been. So that's one of the bigger problems. And that brings me to the cinematic of A War Within. So you have Thrall, you have Anduin, and Anduin's been wandering the world for a few years, struggling with his past and what happened in Shadowlands, and Thrall's coming to get him because things are about to ramp up, okay? That's essentially what's going on. And Anduin has a little bit of a melodramatic moment. There's some imagery paralleling him with Arthas, which is pretty cool, I thought. But overall, there wasn't a lot of action in that cinematic. And you go back to the history of WoW cinematics, you know, even the Arthas one, which still had a lot of things happening, right? It was more of a dramatic cinematic for sure. Not a whole lot of things happening, but there were still, you know, him resurrecting Sindragosa. That was pretty big. The rest of the cinematics mostly have a lot of action, and so this one didn't. And Metzen kind of knew that was going to be the reaction.
I want to remind you all that sometimes very epic things can begin with small, heartfelt moments. What you're about to see is one of those moments.
And he was right, because it wasn't a very epic moment in the sense of it being an action-packed moment. But on the same level of like the Sourfang shorts, does that sell people on an expansion? I don't know. Maybe there will be other cinematics, right? Maybe there will be more, but it does advance the story. And so I do think that people are being a little bit too hard. Initially I was. People are being a little bit too hard on Anduin, and I think that people are also misrepresenting what Anduin is going through, at least in terms of like my interpretation of it. The problem with Anduin isn't just this scene, it's his character and his portrayal over the past few expansions, really since BFA. And even in Legion, because in Legion, I mean, it was understandable. He lost his dad. He was feeling rough, right? And so he doesn't know what to do. And it's like, you do what a king must do. And then he gains this power. And then nothing really happens that much. So then BFA happens and he's still out there crying in the middle of the battlefield and tearing up and stuff like that. So you've got that. And then you have Shadowlands, and then all that stuff in Shadowlands happens, a lot of melodrama. And so now we don't see Anduin for a while, and here he is talking to Thrall, and there's more melodrama. And so when people see all this and they put 2 and 2 together, they're like, dude, I'm sick of seeing this kid crying all the time. Like, grow up, step up and be a man, right? It's not just because of the cinematic, it's because of how Anduin's been portrayed for the past 5 years. Okay, people are ready to move on from this. Okay, fine. Whatever. Let's just come on. Let's get with it, okay? That's the mentality that people have with Anduin, because every time they see him, he's a little bit of a whiner and people are getting sick of it. So it's important to keep that in mind. If you take Anduin, he was controlled by domination magic. And after that, he was scarred, he was wounded, and he ran away, essentially, to find himself or work his stuff out. Now, he's the king of Stormwind. His job is to protect his kingdom, to look after his kingdom, and to another degree, the Alliance as a whole. He's gone. You know who are defending Stormwind? Death Knights. Not just Death Knights, but Death Knights are a part of that. You know what happened to Death Knights? Death Knights were killed or resurrected by domination magic, had their free will stripped away. If you follow the player character story, they were sent off to be fodder by the Lich King, broke free of the Lich King's control, and serve in undeath for however long they exist, I guess. So imagine if you replace Thrall with one of those Death Knights. How does that cinematic play out then? With Anduin having his moment to one of those Death Knights, who has been through significantly more. Or you take an orc that was once controlled by the Blood Rage, okay? Or you take an undead character and throw them out there in place of Thrall. Or even Thrall himself, who grew up in an internment camp, right? And lost his parents at a very young age, right? So you have a story with so many characters that have gone through so much more crap than what Anduin has gone through. And so in the context of the story, it makes it very difficult to listen and feel for what he's been through. Because in the context of the story, he hasn't been through all that much. It's kind of like if you've ever watched Team 4 Star's interpretation of Dragon Ball Z.
Grow up. You act like you are the only one suffering. But I believe that Trunks has some stories for you. And I can assume they all end with, and then he died too. You were a coward to your last whimper.
The flip side of that is when you try to take Anduin's character and you try to understand the story. Now, I don't know what direction they're going in. A lot of people just say, hey, he's suffering from PTSD. That's what's happening. I don't think that's it. That might be part of it. But what I think it is you have a character that has grown up with a connection to the light. There are prophecies about him. He rises up after his dad dies to become the king of Stormwind. And he becomes a pawn under domination magic, just like it was prophesied that he would. He becomes a pawn. And now he realizes that with all the power of the light that was within him, with all of the authority that he has as king of Stormwind, he can be controlled and become a threat to the people he cares about. So this would naturally, I would assume, make him question himself, his willpower, his control of the light, and maybe even the power of the light itself. Is it even worth it if I can be so easily overtaken? And so when you consider all these things and you see, what he's gone through, his faith is shaken. He's having a crisis of faith. He's having a crisis of identity. And that, for a king, is a lot more understandable. Now, does that excuse him running away and hiding for a few years? No, of course not. But World of Warcraft is a story about flawed characters, including Anduin, who's flawed and who has made mistakes. That presents opportunity for him to grow. And while I think it would be good if they maybe stop with the melodrama, the story itself is interesting. And it makes me want to see Anduin grow, regain who he is, regain his faith, and become his dad. There seems to be a goal to make Anduin the character that everybody's wanting. It's just a matter of making that pay off. I think it's time for Blizzard to move on from the melodrama. We get it, but it's time for Anduin to grow up. And I think that's what a lot of people are saying. But in order to get there, I do feel like this moment that Anduin is in right now had to happen. He had to be in this place in order for him to grow into who he's going to become. And all Thrall says is, I trust you, and that clicks for him. So it's always possible that a lot of that stuff was just resolved right there. Just by an old friend saying, it's cool, dude, I trust you. You're my bro, okay? And that's a moment. If they continue with melodrama, and they continue to rehash the melodrama, then I'm going to lose interest, and I'm going to be basically how I've been in Dragonflight. I think that's what WoW needs. It needs to really consider the conflict. It needs to flesh out the characters. Villains need to be villains. It's okay to inject a degree of masculinity. It's okay to have a degree of that, and it's okay to have lighthearted moments and moments of emotional weight and emotional expression. Those are all fine. As long as you don't embellish too much in melodrama, I think you can tell a good story. Those are my thoughts. I hope I articulated them well enough. I hope they made sense. But I would love to hear about what you feel about all of these things in the comments below. With all of that being said, I will see you guys on the next one. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you'd like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is TheKephas. Until next time.